I think when you're doing stigma and discrimination work, it can be tricky to adjust the way you talk for your audience, and you really have to use your gut. In some situations, you'll be able to use words like mad, and it's going to be fine, and people will understand because they come from that consumer movement background. With kind of members of the general public, they may not get it, and you may actually be worsening the situation a little bit by using a word that's potentially stigmatising to people.
The big things around language is that word mental, and mental health, mental illness, mental anything, even mental well-being. For Māori in particular, that word, it does have lots of stigma attached to it, but it's a word that's not really liked, that's not really thought well of, and it makes people think that they're being discriminated against just because of that word there. So when people are talking about mental health, for example, that word mental can just stop people, cut them out of being interested or having any association.
It's knowing that every single person's journey is different, mental distress can take many forms, and so can recovery, and it's just trying to be as accepting and open of all the different experiences, and for people really finding out what's right for them.
I agree, and I think we have to be careful around language and labels, because some people understand what some of those labels mean and some people don't, and there's lots of stigma and stereotypes around labels and mental health, mental wellness, people feeling or being crazy or what have you, and we all have positive and negative stereotypes, connotations that are also fed to us by the media and perpetuated. So I think that we working in this space need to be mindful and careful about the language that we use, and sometimes challenging some of the things that we hear and feeling comfortable to do that and proud to do that, because that's a really important part of our role, is actually walking the talk around this stuff and challenging some of those stereotypes and discrimination.
You know, I think what we see in the media and TV shows and movies is often very far from the reality, it's just really really important to actually not just hear a stereotype, not just hear a diagnosis and think that means A, B and C about the person.
Totally.
I think appropriate's probably the word there. I mean, you have to, as an artist, or you know, if you're writing songs, writing poetry, stuff like that, you want it to be engaging. So you want it, you want it to be interesting. You want to suck people in. But we know that there are certain things that perpetuate stigma, and certain words that change how people view certain experiences. And depending on the audience, what is going to draw people in. And then I like to challenge people with the songs that I write. I want people to hear something and go, I'd never thought of it like that before. And language is a real part of that. So you can be really creative with language, but I would suggest avoiding certain words. You know, we know that there are certain words that are just really stigmatizing, or they kind of perpetuate the same old views of the world that it is that we're trying to change. So, and appropriate again will depend on the audience. It'll depend on the particular message you want to get across with your song, your poem, your speech, your, you know, whatever it is that you're doing. And you want the audience to be engaged by it. So what you say to young people is very different to what you might say to a bunch of academics, or and I'm trying to artify it as much as I can as well. I like playing with language, so but I always just still have this thing sitting in the back of my mind, which is maybe that's not the best word to use right now.
Experience, usually watch language that you know has stigma and discrimination attached and interweaved within it, because that can be very damaging to someone else, even if it's a term that you've claimed that helps you through your journey.
I would consider who's in the room, what level of articulation they require, what industry or sector they come from. Try and speak their language as much as possible. For example, when speaking to a corporate audience, I've found that using things that I wouldn't usually use, like mental illness, is easier for them to relate to because that's what they have heard so constantly. But also in that there's an opportunity to start off with that language that is their language and then move it through to less discriminating language. So you're kind of taking them through a little training session as you're speaking to them by starting off with their language and then moving through to something that is going to be really educational for them to start using.
I think language is very important, if not one of the most important things when telling your story and sharing your experiences, because the language that we use directly influences the person who's hearing the message. Often when you're first telling your story and your experience around mental health, mental distress, you can use a lot of medical jargon because that's the kind of discourse that we hear in society, that we hear in the media, that health professionals kind of use and tell us. So it's quite easy to fall into describing our experiences from a very biomedical lens. And that often, that diminishes the kind of power of our story and the human element of our story, because we miss some of the other social factors and environmental factors and the effects of like racism, sexism, the effects of colonization that will impact on someone and their experience. So when we just view it through the lens of medicalization, that can be lost. So when telling your story, I would kind of caution that you kind of view your experience through a whole raft of different perspectives and find the perspective and the language that really feels good for you and also gets clearly your message to your audience.
I think we need to steer away from using words that, trigger off other feelings, or a word that associates with something else, like illness straight away associates with another feeling of sickness, and things like that.
Like you're never going to get better, like all those sort of underlying beliefs come out, I'm never going to better, I have to use medication, someone else has to help me.
Yeah.
So language that's not stigmatizing and doesn't imply all these kind of underlying beliefs that a lot of people have that aren't very helpful.
So what I would consider when using appropriate language is the audience. You've got to know who you're speaking to, understand what they want to know, understand what your key messages are, and use the appropriate language. It's no use talking clinical to random community people, and vice versa. If you're talking to clinical people, then sometimes the only language they understand is clinical language. So know your audience, think of the context, think of what people want to hear, and just drip feed the information in sound bites.
First and foremost is understanding my own process. So understanding why I'm doing what I'm doing, why I'm there, who I'm interacting with, and understanding my own process allows me to sit in the space and then be able to facilitate and understand what everyone else's needs are. The second thing is to know when I shouldn't be doing something or facilitating. If I'm not feeling like I'm in the right space, understanding that the best thing is possibly not to let that go forward and just do it at a different space and a different time.